Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event, Russia and Ukraine, a panel discussion on the crisis. We live in event-filled times, but very few events divide time for us so that we can confidently say that one era has ended and another has begun. I think all of us will put in that rare category November 9th, 1989, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, signifying the end of the Cold War. September 11th, 2001 is another. I think that it feels quite likely that last Thursday will fall into that category as well, with the attack on Ukraine by Russian military forces. We have an extraordinary panel to discuss this really epoch-shaking event and its consequences. We only have an hour. I'm going to introduce them very quickly, and then we will go on to try to understand the motivations behind this attack and the trajectory for both Russia and Ukraine and the NATO alliance and the West more broadly coming out of it. Let me begin to introduce our very distinguished panelists alphabetically. General Carter Ham is one of the most respected military leaders of his generation, having in the course of a 37-year career in uniform risen from enlisted man to four-star general. He commanded the US Army in Europe from 2008 to 2010 before assuming the leadership of US Africa Command, where he served until his retirement in 2013. He has been Director of Operations for the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. He has also served as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of the United States Army, which he just recently retired from. Wolfgang Ischinger, there aren't very many diplomats who have household names, but Wolfgang may be that one. He is one of contemporary Germany's most renowned diplomats. He's been Germany's ambassador to both the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as State Secretary in the German Foreign Ministry. Wolfgang has just handed over the reins at the Munich Security Conference, which he ran from 2008 till last month. And I'm delighted to say that Wolfgang is also a trustee of the American Academy in Berlin. Eugene Rumer, Senior Fellow and Director of Carnegie's Russia and Eurasia program. He's based in Washington. He is widely considered one of the foremost Russia watchers in the United States today. Prior to joining Carnegie, Eugene was the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the US National Intelligence Council from 2010 to 2014. And in this role, he led the intelligence community's analytic efforts and served as Senior Intelligence Advisor to the policy community. He has held appointments at the National Defense University, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the RAND Corporation. Finally, Daniela Schwarzer. Daniela is the Executive Director of Europe and Eurasia at the Open Society Foundation and one of Germany's leading experts on European affairs and transatlantic international relations. The Open Society Foundation, Daniela just reminded us, is also the largest NGO operating in Ukraine today. Prior to joining Open Society, Daniela was Director and Chief Executive Officer of the German Council on Foreign Relations. She's been on the executive team at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She has been a special advisor to European leaders such as EU High Representative Joseph Borrell and to countries including Poland and France during the preparation of their EU presidencies. Before we start, let me just say we will have a discussion for about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. You are free to begin sending in your questions into the Q&A column, the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. I see we've got one already. Please do not raise your hand because that feature is not activated. I will get to as many as I can. I'd like to start by going around the table, the virtual table, and asking a few questions of our panelists. And I'll start with Eugene. Eugene, this war was started by a Russian, so I believe it's appropriate to start with you. It's been variously said that Vladimir Putin wants to recreate the Russian Empire when it was at its pinnacle, and that he has been pursuing a policy of insulating Russia with a cordon of pliant neighboring regimes. He's taken numerous steps that have sought to rewrite the geography of Russia and the politics, of course, of Russia and Eurasia by invading Georgia, occupying Crimea, supporting breakaway regions in Ukraine, and meddling in the affairs of that country for more than a decade. Yet I think we would agree that those acts were all calibrated and hardly earth-shattering compared to the wholesale invasion of Ukraine, now widely considered the biggest war in Europe since 1945. How do you explain Putin taking such a dramatic move with such extraordinary consequences, not only for the people of Ukraine, but also for those of Russia?
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks for including me in this distinguished company, even on such a sad occasion. The short answer is that we don't have many insights into Putin's mind. So a lot of what we know about him really is second guessing, trying to figure out based on his public statements. But Ukraine has been a long-standing obsession of his. He tried in 2004 during the Orange Revolution to bring it back into the fold. In 2010 with the election of Viktor Yanukovych. In 2014, as you mentioned, with Crimea. And now again, now you might ask, why now? Why at this moment? We don't really know, but there's a series of events that have occurred recently that suggest that perhaps something really changed in his mind, and his risk calculus has changed over the past year to however much time. I would say that his isolation over the last 2 years has not probably helped his limited contact with Western leaders. Over the years, I should say that Chancellor Merkel played a phenomenal role in sort of reaching out to this insular leader. She's gone. I think that's been a factor. There's not a leader in the Western world who can bring him to sort of a sense to bring to him a dose of reality. I think the narrative of the West's decline and decadence has been very prominent and internalized by senior members of the Russian elite, and that clearly has affected Putin. And then I think just sitting wherever he sits, in Sochi, in the dacha, or in the Kremlin, getting these intelligence reports about Ukraine moving closer and closer and closer to the West. And the point that is made, it's not so much Ukraine in NATO, but NATO in Ukraine. I think that really has had an effect, and the idea that the United States is now weakened after Afghanistan. I think we can't really point to any one of these developments as the decisive factor, but taken together, I think they really do amount to that critical mass that put him over the top. Clearly, he's surrounded by just a handful of advisors, and they're not really advisors, they're his employees, and I think they have to guess the boss's mood to really give him the advice that will not get him into trouble.
Yeah, I have to say that when you look at the video footage of him meeting with anyone and being at the far end of an enormous table, it bespeaks a very, very strange self-consciousness at this particular point. But let me ask you this, given where we are, can you imagine Putin stopping anywhere short of complete victory that gives him control of Ukraine?
No, I don't see that. Given his long-standing obsession with Ukraine as being integral to the great Russian state that he sees himself as rebuilding, given what he's put on the table by way of the military capabilities, he's now risked the well-being of his economy. On that, I don't see him stopping now until he is in Kiev, even if it takes to reduce Kiev to absolute rubble. Right. It's a really dangerous situation that we're in. We tend to think about things that we have done as sort of being separated in different lanes. So we have pursued the path of economic sanctions, but I don't know that everybody who is really thinking about it in our governments fully appreciates the extent to which the sanctions that have been put in place so far constitute a nuclear option. We have taken away effectively Putin's ultimate shield, his reserves with which he had planned to protect the economy from Western sanctions. That is an act of war as I read it, and he's not going to stop.
Well, that's a chilling remark, and we'll come back to the whole question because preventing an escalation that spills over the borders of Ukraine seems to me to be one of the foremost issues of the day. Carter, let me turn to you now. This has been a strange military campaign, and one that appears not, at least in its initial phase, to have gone the way that Putin would have liked. It appears that he wanted to essentially seize control, that is, his military would seize control of Ukraine within just a few days and essentially stun the Ukrainian people into submission before they could muster an armed opposition. We've all seen the videos of the burned out tanks and other vehicles. What is your view of how do we explain this this campaign to date?
Well, first, Dan, thanks very much for the invitation to join, and it truly is an extraordinary panel. And I agree with much of what Eugene just spoke about. From a military standpoint, you're exactly right. This has not gone the way that any senior Russian military official would have anticipated. They would have expected, I think, a very quick strike into Kyiv, to essentially topple the government, and they had reason to believe that that was achievable. Russia possesses essentially all military advantage, perhaps with one exception, an important exception. They control the borders in the north, the east, and largely in the south since the illegal annexation of Crimea. They have dominant forces in the naval forces in the Black Sea. The proximity of their bases in Russia and in Belarus give them, as we've seen over the past months and more recently in the past couple of weeks, the ability to reposition and stage air, land, and missile forces essentially at will, without any opposition on the borders of Ukraine before they actually undertook the invasion. Those are decided military advantages. And on top of that, of course, Russia has an overwhelming advantage in size and modernization of equipment when compared to Ukraine. So I think the current circumstance was one that was likely not anticipated by Russian military leaders. And that gets to the one advantage that Ukraine has, and that is the will to fight. And we have seen that manifest over the past several days now. We're outgunned, outmanned, but the will to fight for their country, I think, has certainly been, I have to assume, has been somewhat of a surprise to Russian military leaders. So the question now is, what to expect. We've seen naval forces attack Ukraine from the Black Sea with missile forces. We've seen an amphibious assault to isolate the important port. We've seen increasing ruthlessness, particularly in the urban areas with missile and artillery strikes. And from reports this morning, essentially the isolation was almost a siege, if you will, of Kharkiv in the northeastern part of the country, the second largest city in Ukraine. So what to expect from now? I think my guess is that there is, as Eugene mentioned, there's probably difficulty from the military leaders accurately portraying to the civilian leadership in Moscow what's actually happening on the ground, because what's happening on the ground is not what was desired or expected. And so the challenge will be, I think, for the Russian military is how do they achieve the military ends, which I think have likely been directed to them, which is, capture the capital city, topple the government. How do you do that without, as Eugene suggests, without rubbling the city, without strengthening the resolve of the Ukrainian people? One needs to think only of the Russian experience in World War II, where Russians, vastly outgunned and by a far better trained, more experienced, better equipped German army, fought in the rubbles of Stalingrad. And I think Russia will remember that and say they don't want to create a similar circumstance in Kyiv or anywhere else. So this is really difficult. One last thing I would say is that the capability that the Ukrainians have demonstrated so far with equipment that is at least a generation older than what they're opposing on the Russian side, in numbers that don't match the Russian side, have acquitted themselves quite well. We have seen, numbers probably exaggerated, but certainly have seen the Ukrainians have some success against armored columns, against the aircraft. We've seen effective employment of small unmanned aerial systems in destroying armored vehicles. And we're seeing, I think, again, the resolve of the people. So the question, I think, at this point is that, as Eugene suggests, Russia does not stop. There certainly will be a long-standing insurgency in Ukraine. And how does Russia deal with that? And importantly, how does the West deal with that after the major conflict that comes to an end? So I think the next week or so will be really telling in the future of this conflict.
Kind of hard to believe that Vladimir Putin, who has watched our experience in Afghanistan, who saw his own country's experience in Afghanistan, who watched Iraq and has watched in so many other places, actually could underestimate the possibility for an insurgency that would face him. It's really quite remarkable. But let me ask you this. Eugene, I think, got straight to the point when he talked about rubble. It would seem to me that the appropriate fear right now is a replay of the Chechnya campaign of the early days of Putin's career. And anyone who remembers those pictures of the capital city of Grozny, which resembled nothing so much as German cities at the end of 1945, extraordinary potential for loss of life and atrocities of all kind. Is that where you would say this is tending?
Sadly, I think yes. I don't envision. I mean, I think President Zelensky's been pretty clear. I don't see the resolve of the Ukrainian people getting to the point where there is surrender or some kind of agreement with Russia. And I think there will be, though I think Russian military leaders will understand the risks and the challenges of urban combat, particularly in rubbling a city. I think the political will and political direction to them, the civilian direction to them, will be that's what they must do. And so I think that's the future that lies ahead of us.
Yeah, Daniela, it's now become almost a truism in the press and among analysts that Vladimir Putin has created exactly the Europe or the West that he didn't want, in having driven everyone together through his brutality and having united everyone in their conviction to stop all this. It's been said that Germany has had undergone a revolution in its foreign policy and security thinking virtually overnight. And I was wondering if you could describe that for us, and particularly whether you could answer the question whether you think it is a durable change.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thanks for having me on this panel. Yes, there are two dimensions in your question. First of all, the way Europe is aligned, not only the member states of the European Union with each other and the UK, but also the alignment across the Atlantic in providing or preparing very substantive sanction packages that the world to date hasn't seen, and moving forward so swiftly in implementing those sanctions. And I think this is really the world that Putin didn't expect he would face when he attacks Ukraine. Germany is an interesting country to look at in all of this because of Germany's quite unique economic ties with Russia, a long-standing political dialogue with Russia. And you mentioned a previous speaker mentioned Angela Merkel as a key person who, when she was still German Chancellor, actually had this direct contact with Vladimir Putin to discuss Ukraine. And Merkel was a key pillar in the Normandy format, which was set up to settle the conflict in eastern Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea. So Germany always plays a special role vis-à-vis Russia in the EU, and it has dependencies on Russia, in particular with regards to energy imports, gas notably. So the policy adjustment in Germany, in my view, did not happen overnight, but still very quickly. The US, the Biden government, which is not so new now, obviously, but when it came into office, very quickly started to discuss Nord Stream 2 with then still the Merkel government, and still last summer, they reached a kind of compromise of not sanctioning Germany for continuing to build Nord Stream 2, but at the same time, Germany understood more and more that it could no longer uphold its position that this is just a business project and has nothing to do with foreign policy or strategic reflection on the strategy vis-à-vis Russia. And as soon as it became clear that Russia would actually use this enormous troop buildup that Europe and the US had been watching since the end of last year to actually invade Ukraine, it became very clear in Germany that Nord Stream 2 was no longer a project the government could hold on to. And before this real revolution in German security and foreign policy that we witnessed last weekend with a really historical speech by our Chancellor in Parliament at a special session on Sunday morning, I think even before that, it became obvious that Germany had to change policy. So the steps were, first of all, in the area of energy, a halt to Nord Stream 2. Then on Friday night, the commitment to deliver defensive weapons to Ukraine. Also a long struggle, and I witnessed several occasions where the Ukrainian ambassador really publicly criticized the German government for it and really appealed to their sense of responsibility and the necessity to overcome Germany's reluctant position on exporting arms to conflict zones, because for Ukraine, receiving arms because of its outdated equipment that has already been mentioned, this played an increasing role in the German debate. Now, what then happened on Sunday was several things at the same time. First of all, the Chancellor really framed the war in Ukraine in a very broad and really substantive way, saying this is not about Ukraine, it is about democracy and freedom on our continent. And he actually committed Germany to defending democracy and freedom on the European continent. So he moved Germany into this key role that consecutive policy makers and Chancellor Merkel in particular, in a way had assumed already, though in a very different security context. Let's remember Merkel's speech at the Munich Security Conference. I think it was in 2019, just before it became impossible to hold the MSC because of COVID. And she held the speech, which again gave her, commentators gave her the title of being the leader of the free world after this big speech, which was not so much directed towards Russia, but at the time a speech directed mostly towards the US, because Donald Trump was questioning many achievements that had been built in the transatlantic relationship, but then also the global order based on Western liberal norms. And she held that speech, she took that leadership, but nothing really ever followed. And even 5 years before that, the speech that Federal President Gauck delivered, where he spoke about German responsibility, again at Wolfgang's Munich Security Conference, that was the first time we had a series of speeches led by the federal president, which was about Germany's responsibility. And now comes Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, who's only been in office since December, who in this situation of war on the EU's doorstep, 2 flight hours away from Berlin, delivers a speech where he not only recommits Germany to stability, freedom, and democracy on the European continent, but he also comes forward with very concrete measures how he will back this up. And most of the measures are in the area of defense. So first of all, a clear commitment to very quickly, actually this year, to move to meeting the 2% of GDP expenditure targets for defense that NATO agreed upon years ago and which Germany should meet by 2024. But we all know that given the track record and the defense spending planning that is already public, this wouldn't have happened. So he makes an extra jump and says, we will commit to those goals as of now. He announced the creation of a special investment fund of 100 billion euros for defense investment. And he also pictured the future of conflict, if you like, in a very modern way, explaining why both cyber, hybrid warfare, the necessity to work on resilience, because it has to be recognized that governments can no longer protect, but have to also invest in resilience, so societies, economic systems, critical infrastructure can jump back if there's an attack. I think this was a very comprehensive and important statement on how this government thinks about security and which responsibility Germany is going to take in this continental perspective, as I mentioned. Now, he also commits very clearly to European cooperation and also to transatlantic cooperation. That was very smartly done. First mentioning nuclear sharing and the necessity to provide the fighter jets in Germany. And then secondly, speaking about European armaments projects and working very closely with France on those. Just one last point, because I don't want to be too long. The second really important element on top of defense was that recognition that Germany has to work on its energy security and has to diversify sources. Frankly, we have known this since the annexation of Crimea, because then the issue of European energy security really came to the surface, and there are so many analyses of energy dependencies and what Europe would need to do to reduce its energy dependency. Not enough was done, and now we have again this leap forward where Schutz declared that he would open 2 LNG terminals as quickly as was possible, provide the necessary investment, step up funding for renewable energies, and so on. So there's also in that regard, which is not so much about an active foreign policy, but more about creating the conditions for a stronger, well, more options basically, because Germany can that way take a more aggressive stance vis-a-vis Russia. Those are really important moves. Right. But I would say the bottom line is really the framing in a European way and the deep anchoring of Germany in Europe, because if he follows through with what he announced, we will be the most important defense spender. The finance minister said he wants to see the most agile, most modern army on the continent in Germany, and that will mean something for our partners in Europe.
Yeah, thank you for that. Wolfgang, I'm sure that was a phrase you did not expect to hear for many years about Germany creating that kind of military. And I am curious what you think about the durability of this resolve. You know, we're in the morning after right now here in Berlin, and the radio is filled with anonymous quotations from SPD members of the Bundestag who aren't so thrilled with where their government has gone. So I'd like you to comment on that. But what I really would like you to tell us as a master diplomat is, can you see any off-ramps? Is there any way to avoid the worst in this massive and spiraling conflict?
Well, first of all, thanks, Dan, for including me in this discussion. This is, of course, not just a pivotal moment, as Daniela just explained, for German foreign policy, and I'll come back to that in just a second. It's a pivotal, historic moment for Europe and probably for the world, because, as we all know, our friends in Beijing are going to be watching this minute by minute. And they will draw their conclusions as they ponder their own options. By the way, if I could just make that point right here, I cannot imagine that Xi Jinping is at this moment very happy with his friend in Moscow, because what cannot be attractive for the Chinese leadership can be a NATO united, can be a European Union strengthened, can be the idea of the West, reaffirmed, can be of the United States demonstrating after the difficulties, to put it diplomatically, with the departure from Afghanistan half a year ago, the United States now demonstrating really capable and elegant and intense leadership. When I look at the numbers of times that Tony Blinken and the National Security Council folks and the president himself have spent, taking the members of the alliance with them, that was impressive as far as I'm concerned, as a practicing diplomat. Now, I want to offer one word of caution. I don't disagree at all with what Daniela has just said, but the point I want to make is that Germans tend to be, romantic. Germans have entertained, since the days of unification, a romantic love affair with the status quo, believing that, paradise has broken out and we can get rid of the Bundeswehr, and that we will have a partnership with Russia forever, and also, by the way, with China, and so on and so forth. It is absolutely stunning to me personally that if you had taken a poll half a year ago, most Germans, led by their respective political parties, by public opinion, so would have said, oh, no, we want more pensions, we want more social security, etc. Don't give more money to the Bundeswehr. And when I look at the poll taken yesterday or earlier today, if I remember correctly, more than 70% of Germans, more than 2/3, are now saying, fantastic, very good, Olaf Scholz, 100 billion, why not even more? This is, in my view, this is a little worrisome. They like to go over the top. And then the next step is that you can read on the social media and in certain newspapers, you can read, well, next thing we're going to do is take Vladimir Putin to the court in The Hague. Well, you've got to catch him first, right? Before you can take him to the court in The Hague. And that's going to be a long, long time away. In other words, we tend to be romantic, and we are not really settled as our political elites go in the kind of real Kissingerian realpolitik that I would like to see. Henry was, of course, one of the founders of the American Academy. So I like to just, quote his kind of approach to these issues. I am worried that depending on the outcome of the current war, the Putin war, the resolve, the admiration which Olaf Scholz has enjoyed over the last 3 days after this speech may actually, evaporate rather quickly. I am not sure how solid this is going to be over the long term, because as you said, there are, of course, and they will not just evaporate in the air. There are, of course, established pacifist elements, not only in the Green Party, but certainly also in the left wing of the SPD. And that is going to make it challenging, to put it mildly, to keep this tripartite coalition together if and when the going gets rougher. And we don't know. I've listened carefully to what Eugene and Carter have said. We don't know whether this war is going to not only to get a lot more ugly, which I expect it to be in coming days or weeks. We also don't know whether we can really guarantee that there will be no spillover into NATO territory. I hope that's not going to happen, but I'm worried about the nuclear threats that Vladimir Putin likes to utter. And that takes me finally to your question about the off-ramp. Yes, indeed. I'm not the military expert. I'm a diplomat. So I think that the idea of a negotiated end of this conflict, whether it's in the initial stage simply a ceasefire, then followed on by more intense discussions about a negotiated outcome. I cannot imagine that the current Moscow leadership and the current government in Ukraine will be in a position, if they negotiate together across a table, I cannot imagine that they could ever reach any significant compromise on any issue. The Russian demands are totally unacceptable to Ukraine and vice versa. So to make a simple point, I think that what is needed now, maybe not today, but hopefully in coming days, depending on what happens on the ground, militarily speaking, I think that we need, or this situation requires a mediator, a third party, to help these guys, the Russians and the Ukrainians, figure out a way to end the conflict, to not, create rubble in a city of 3 million like Kiev. Who could be the mediator? I'm not going to speculate. Quite frankly, I was happy. This is a very personal remark. I was very happy that I was able to invite the president of Finland, Sauli Niinisto, to the Munich Security Conference. And his country, before this war broke out, was hoping that we could, in a couple of years' time, celebrate the opening of the Helsinki process, which started in 1973 and of course ended importantly in 1975. And Sauli Niinisto has had a good talking relationship with President Putin. But then again, it seems to me that in this war situation, a country that is a small country, a small neighboring country of Russia, may not carry the gravitas, may not be able to play the role that you would actually need. So I think I would hope that some larger actor in the international sphere would be capable of taking that role. Finally, one last word. When I think back, my own diplomatic career started in the 1970s at the United Nations. And in those days, one would have immediately thought of the Secretary General of the United Nations as a possible intermediary carrying messages back and forth, etc. It is sad for me to see that doesn't even appear on the radar screen of anyone anymore. In other words, the decline, the unfortunate decline of the role of the United Nations and other international institutions that are so elementary to the kind of international rules-based system that all of us believe in. I'll stop here.
Okay. Well, I think what we have seen is that the current situation has so many ramifications and different dimensions that we could, we have quite a lot to talk about and not a lot of time to do it. So I want to just quickly throw out a few questions. I think this one, Eugene, has your name on it, but I'd be happy to hear from Carter or anyone else. Escalation. You mentioned that we had essentially, we, the West, the United States, had used the nuclear option in going after Russian reserves, so that the economic, what is going on economically in Russia right now is deserves the term shock and awe much more than anything that happened, I think, in Iraq many years ago. Additionally, one of the dogs that hasn't barked yet is cyber attacks on a large scale outside of Ukraine. And as most, I think, international relations experts agree, we don't yet have the rules of the road on cyber. And when cyber then turns into a prompt for a conventional response or worse. So what are you, in all this mess, what can we do to prevent an escalation, and what are you most worried about?
I worry about precisely what you just said. I'm not a cyber expert. I don't know what we can do to prevent them. Based on, I, as a consumer of other people's wisdom in this field, think that in this instance, we just have to have our defenses way up, and that's probably happening, I have to guess. But, you know, we have seen some things, early indications and relatively small indications of what can happen last spring in the United States with the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline. So, you know, I don't want to create a sense of panic, but I think that now that we have sort of taken away Putin's most significant weapon in his toolkit for defending the Russian economy, and if you look actually at what he's been doing over the past 8 years since 2014, it's all been about sanction proofing to the extent possible the Russian economy. If you look at the 2021 national security strategy, it's all about that. It's the one that he signed in July. So I think in this instance, it's you know, all manner of defenses and preparedness, which is what our cyber homeland security in the US and their counterparts in Europe have been talking about. And I could very seriously look at that possibility. I also think that we're going to see a significant step up in attacks, short of a clear Article 5 Article 5 type contingency against the Baltic states. They've already been under assault in various domains, but if you look at, again, I don't want to create a sense of panic, but we now have to be realistic about what things Putin will do, having said he can't possibly do this, and he's done all these things. But, you know, if you look at his justifications for attacking Ukraine, it's denazification, it's demilitarization, and it's preventing genocide of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And all of those three have been critical pieces, staples of Russian propaganda against the Baltics. So I would, you know, heighten their defenses, and their, however they want to, they can immunize themselves, shield themselves against what probably is coming, because clearly, sorry.
No, go on, finish up.
Clearly they're next. You know, I mean, we don't talk much about Moldova, but, you know, they're in a very precarious situation. You know, anywhere you look, I think everything is on the table. I don't believe that Putin is suicidal to actually launch a nuclear strike. I think that nuclear statement was more about declaring the seriousness of his intent in situations rather than actual threat, especially since, based on what we know, there haven't really been any moves to put the forces on heightened alert. Over.
Carter, quickly, we have got most of the countries of Europe now shipping weapons to Ukraine, which are then, I guess, being taken across the Romanian and the Polish borders. Are you worried about, you know, Russian intelligence finding out about a particular plane and launching a missile at it or something like that? It would seem to me that that's another area where we should be quite concerned about spillover.
I think that's a very legitimate concern. You know, the overland transport it will be much more difficult for Russia to interfere with. But just like in the United States, most of those systems operate on unclassified, often unsecured networks. And so, again, to your point about the risk of cyber activities to disrupt those kinds of movements, I think are very, very likely. More troublesome, as we've seen the discussion publicly about the transfer of aircraft, military aircraft, the training of Ukrainian pilots, And if there are similar aircraft to which they've already trained on, MiG-29s and other types of aircraft, that transition period will be pretty rapid. But I think you're exactly right. Will Russia, seek to down an aircraft flying from Poland into Ukraine? Probably not. But they certainly possess the capability to attack and interfere flights once they are in Ukrainian airspace. And I think this is part of the reason we've seen President Zelensky request a no-fly zone, but pretty rapidly rejected by the United States and others. One comment on the nuclear point, I think Eugene's point is right. We have not detected, at least to my knowledge, we have not detected any significant heightening of readiness of Russia's nuclear forces, but certainly a reminder from President Putin to say, hey, we have this capability. And I think it brings to mind, this is probably more in Ambassador Issinger's portfolio than purely military, but what is deterrence in this environment? It seems to me, we've relied for most of my life on nuclear deterrence, that my nuclear capability will deter your use of your nuclear capability. But in this instance, we have seen perhaps Russia's nuclear capability to deter the United States and others' conventional capabilities. And I think to Eugene's point, I think it's interesting phraseology that the economic sanctions are a nuclear option perceived by Russia. So I think we're entering a whole new phase of what is deterrence in these days that we find ourselves. It's not just nuclear versus nuclear deterrence.
Yeah. Daniela and Wolfgang, you'll probably want to join in on this. The UN is estimating refugee flows of roughly 4 million people. I think 500,000 to date is already some kind of grisly record. Are Europe's leaders capable of dealing with this kind of fallout from this conflict? And what is the potential there for changing how people feel about what we are now all involved in?
I think in a first reaction, there is a very strong sense of solidarity also with refugees coming into, at the moment, mostly Poland, across the border to other countries as well. But Poland at the moment is the largest recipient. But we also hear first reports about tensions building up locally, where suddenly many people are and actually the preparations haven't had enough time to be really in place. The political reaction from the European Union was very interesting, with the idea tabled by the European Commission on Friday to actually lift the time limit that Ukrainians can stay in the European Union. Right now, there's visa-free travel for 90 days into the Schengen zone. And the idea was to extend this to up to 3 years. Which would create a wholly different situation and would also enable Ukrainians who stay for a longer time to actually integrate into the labor market, which is interesting for both sides, obviously. I see at the same time a strong civil society mobilization that is underway, a readiness to donate both money but also things. And right now you see across the EU websites going up with offers you can make how you want to help in this crisis. And I do think, in particular in Germany, the experience of the year 2015, when we had an inflow of 1 million refugees from Syria and neighboring countries, that has actually less traces. So there are institutions, there are reflexes to accommodate, and so on and so on. However, I think 4 million or more, frankly, in my view, if the conflict develops in the way that has been discussed on this panel, that will be a huge challenge. And the biggest task right now for Europeans, besides the practical need to actually provide shelter and food and clothes and everything that people who arrive will need, is to create a system between EU member states that has some kind of solidarity mechanism to share both the financial burden that this will be, but also to go back to the question of how do we distribute quotas across member states, because right now we are still in the situation where people arrive you know, they have to be treated first, but we need a buy-in of all 27 member states to make this a joint challenge. And I am worried at this point that there may be tensions because it happens very quickly. And if the 4 million are right, this is a big figure. It could be even bigger.
Yeah. Well, given that we still have people stranded in Greece from the last crisis, I think those fears are justified. Wolfgang, did you have anything you wanted to add on?
Yeah, just thanks, Dan. Just one footnote to this. Well, of course, this is a major challenge, no doubt about it, but it's also an opportunity. Look, when we had the inflow of refugees from the south a few years ago, the European Union was unable to get its act together and agree on a comprehensive policy. The Eastern members refused to accept any refugees from the south. And I may be over optimistic, but I think that President Putin, by starting this war, is actually offering us a chance within the European Union, now that we have the Eastern members having to deal with refugees, to actually agreeing a joint policy, because now the Eastern members are in the same boat, so to speak, with those among EU members who were willing and actually did accept hundreds of thousands, even millions from the Middle East and elsewhere. So look at it also as the medium and longer term as an opportunity to resolve a divisive issue, which this refugee and migration issue has been for the last 5-6 years or so for the EU. I think this can actually, this pressure that is currently developing can actually bring the EU together. So, you know, in addition to uniting NATO and making thoughts about NATO being brain dead, disappear completely, going up in smoke, in addition to uniting the European Union on sanctions in a previously unforeseen way, Putin has actually produced additional opportunities for us to get our act together much better. And I think that is something that they did not see coming in Moscow.
We are close to the end of our time. I'd love to go over. I have already been sprinkling in some of the questions from the audience, but let me quickly present a few more. First of all, for anyone who wants to take it, how does this end without, or is it a prerequisite for this ending that ultimately Putin will be gone? Does anyone want to touch that one?
Well, let me try. This being the conflict, the actual
this
active
conflict
phase of the war, yes, it can end, and as Carter said, you know, it can transition into probably a long-term insurgency. This being confrontation with the West, I struggle to imagine a situation in which Putin could once again be a meaningful, acceptable interlocutor to any Western leader, and he's presently, well, he's got to get reelected in 2024, by the terms of the newly revised constitution, he can stay there until 2036. He's only 70 later this year, so he can be there for a long, long time. And I just don't see how the damaged relationship between Russia and the rest of Europe and the West more broadly gets repaired with him at the helm.
Yeah, which certainly I think does suggest that the future is going to look very different from the past, and that we will really be in two worlds. And one of the big questions here is, where will China be?
Yes.
And I think that is one of the big things that we've only begun to think about.
If I just may on this, you know, we're now in a situation in Russia. We see a situation in Russia in which Putin is the regime. So I think another thing for us to worry about is that when he goes, the regime will go, and there's really nothing else waiting in the wings. And that too is a very troubling situation, as we saw in 1991.
Well, that actually is a fascinating observation. And, you know, when we look at Putin's behavior, he does seem to have bottled up in him, and certainly his many writings and statements suggest this, that he embodies the kind of frustration about Russia's humiliation that the far right in Germany did in the 20s and the early 30s about the humiliation of Germany. And I guess the question that I would ask, and I think Eugene, this is also for you, but anyone else who knows Russia well should answer it, is he alone in that regard? Or is Russia as a country doomed to be frustrated and resentful?
We're going to spend the day discussing here the kind of intellectual origins of Putinism, which really do exist. I mean, he's not alone.
We only have 20 seconds for this, though.
He's not alone. There are definitely ideological, cultural, historical foundations for it, but he has elevated Russia. You know, when we talk about the role of personality in politics, he's certainly played a major role that I think other leaders of Russia in his place, perhaps, you know, we couldn't have imagined this with Boris Yeltsin. We couldn't have imagined this probably with another leader like Mikhail Kasyanov, who was at the time, its early days of prime minister and so on. So, no, he's certainly made a difference.
So for anyone who knows, another questioner asks, is Putin listening to anyone domestically or internationally?
Wolfgang, did you get any sense from your conversations with the Russians at this meeting, at the conference?
Well, all I can say is that everything that I've heard over the last year or couple of years, even since the pandemic broke out, is that the man has been extremely isolated, insulated. One of his close German friends, and I hope he would not be offended if I mentioned this here, but everybody knows the name of Matthias Warnig, who is the CEO of the Nord Stream venture, and he and Putin go back, you know, to their youth, so to speak, when Putin was an intelligence officer in East Germany, and even people like Matthias Warnig, who have a trusted relationship with Putin, have had difficulty because of the restrictions existing to meet with him in a room. And if that's true for people like Warnig, who is a businessman essentially, it must be even worse for senior officials from various government institutions, etc., not to speak of such places as the Academy of Sciences. I participated over the last number of years, each year at one or two events organized by the International Department of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And Putin used to show up himself to talk and to speak, etc. He hasn't done that now in the last several years. One time he sent his foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov. But in other words, even with this intellectual environment in the Academy of Science with very smart people around, there is apparently, that's all I can say from what I know, there's apparently no direct communication anymore. It has disappeared.
Okay, unfortunately, I know that some of you have to get off to your next conference or your next briefing. I can't thank you all enough for participating in this. I hope we can gather again sometime soon, because the target is moving faster than any of us can keep track of. I want to thank our very large audience for joining us for this. I'm sorry we only got to a few questions, but this is a sprawling topic and it will be with us for some time to come. Thank you very much, and let's all hope for the unexpected and a good outcome of some kind, at least the cessation of the killing sometime soon. Thank you very much for joining us from the American Academy in Berlin.